Item 6.3.4 talks about the site being in flood zone 1 and low risk of flooding. Flooded is perhaps too strong a word here, as I'm more concerned with the drainage of water from the Willow Grange site to the south. I've been on the site after heavy rainfall, and the hedgerow on the southern boundary has been flowing like a small stream with water coming from the Willow Grange site. This development, just concrete over a large open field, which means that less water soaks away and it moves to the next field. The additional water then flows across the valley towards the corner of Forstall Lane and Wells Street, which in turn floods down the public highway into the Lewes Valley. Item 6.40 mentions fund, if you are going to approve it. Item 6.40 mentions funding from the Southborough Primary School to improve facilities there. But if a family moves into Coxheath, they might expect their children to go to the nearest school and perhaps even walk there. Coxheath School has applied for and were granted extra classrooms due to the Willow Grange development, but they seem to get nothing out of a site which is nearly twice as big. The local infrastructure needs looking at before we can provide anything for local residents who already live there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. Almost exactly on time. Councillor Mrs Grigg, please.
Although this application is not directly in my ward, it's important that I comment due to the proximity and impact of these proposals on Lewes Village. There is strong opposition from Lewes residents. The impact of traffic leaving the development via Forstall Lane into Wells Street is wholly unacceptable. Wells Street is a narrow, single-track lane with few passing places. As you get closer to the village, there's lots of street parking and the road is generally in a poor condition. I refer members to correspondence dated the 5th of June 17 from DHA Transport to Planning, in which it states, "It is likely that traffic would route north along Wells Street to gain access to the A229 and Maidstone Town Centre via Old Lewes Village. This route is highly unsuitable to take extra traffic flows. The proposed mitigation to prevent the use of Wells Street is insufficient to stop the severe impact of additional traffic from the site. The idea of a no right turn for exiting traffic is ridiculous, as it will be ignored, and as we all know here, it's completely unenforceable. I have discussed future signing with SMART, and we believe a more effective solution would be to restrict traffic from travelling north on Wells Street beyond the Gordon Court entrance through provision of no entry signs supported by advance warning signs at Forstall Farm. Any use of Wells Street will also mean an increase of traffic in Busbridge Road. The deterioration of this narrow country lane is well documented. This will pose another risk to car users, as it is very dangerous in places with sheer drops to the north side. Drivers already expect long delays at Linton Crossroads and search out alternative routes to avoid congestion. This will only get worse. Its chosen access would create unacceptable pressure on the rat running of unsuitable country lanes. This proposal also creates a significant risk to pedestrians. Forstall Lane and Wells Street are walked regularly and there are no verges to allow vehicles to pass. There are other issues, such as the contribution associated vehicles will make to air quality, which is obviously of great concern, the corrosive impact on the anti-coalescent belt between Coxheath and Lewes. Planning legislation is very clear that community identities should be protected. The village suffers due to flooding from this area. Large volumes of water leave the northeast corner and Wells Street becomes a channel for water and debris. In January 16, flood water continued to flow for 3 weeks. Without underground springs, extra development will only exacerbate the situation. To summarise, I believe that the development and its access as currently proposed is not sustainable, and that the severe impacts that the design creates locally have not been realistically recognised or mitigated. Neither is the increasing traffic congestion at Linton Crossroads, to which this development contributes. Therefore, I ask that this application is refused until common sense prevails and workable and funded mitigation proposals are provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grigg. Councillor Fuller, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Committee. I've been a councillor for nearly 18 months now, and at no point in that time have I received the volume of emails, calls and letters as I have on this single planning application. We've had residents who we never hear from, who quietly go about their day-to-day, and their only interaction with the council is when they pay their council tax, and they have reached out to us about this planning application. The trouble is that these residents have become completely disillusioned with the ability of local government to listen to their needs. Our young people need affordable housing, but it is a failure of our borough that we can't make brave decisions to put it in the right place and with the right infrastructure. Unfortunately, the papers you have in front of you give anything but the full picture. In there is a recommendation for approval by officers who don't even live here, traffic consultants who live in the West Country, and by Kent County Council, which has just found a few million to give its councillors a 15% pay rise, with roads riddled by potholes.
Would you stick to the planning application, please, or I will stop you.
I implore you to reject this application, and if you can't, adjourn the decision until every single one of you visits the site, sees the access onto Forstall Lane and realises that it is ludicrous that Forstall Lane, Stockett Lane and Wells Street take car journeys for 210 houses. I implore you to make that journey and not approve this application until you understand the impact this development will have on our village and on our borough. Thank you.
Right, as there's been a lot of, well, I think almost all of the discussion really has been about Kent Highways, that the report and the highway issue, that the appropriate thing is to ask Mr Wright to explain the Kent Highways position at this point before we go any further.
Thank you, Chairman. I think up front I'd like to just make it clear that the Highway Authority has provided full and extensive consultation comments on this planning application. We are required to assess each application on its individual merits. In the case of this particular application, access has been proposed via Forstall Lane, so that is what we have had to review. And we've had to make our recommendations based on the suitability of that proposal. The applicants have recognised that Forstall Lane is not suitable in its current form, and they have therefore proposed to upgrade the road to a standard that is capable of accommodating two-way traffic flow, as well as providing a new pedestrian footway. Importantly, they have also proposed to realign the Forstall Lane junction with Stockett Lane, which will improve visibility. All of these works would need to be secured via a Section 278 agreement with the Highway Authority. The site access onto Forstall Lane can be designed in such a way so as to deter movements to and from Wells Street to the north. Contrary to what's been suggested earlier, this wouldn't just be signs. There are a number of different approaches that could be used. The applicant has proposed that the junction is configured in such a way to make the manoeuvre to and from Wells Street more difficult and therefore less attractive. I'm also aware that the DHA report that was submitted on behalf of an objector has put forward a build-out arrangement with a priority working. So the Highway Authority is aware that there are different ways of tackling the issue, but is confident that a solution is achievable and deliverable. Now, given the location of the site and the positioning of the access, clearly there is the likelihood that development trips will route to and from the north via Stockett Lane, or even though it's a tortuous route, via Wells Street. We know that road users do seek to choose routes that are the quickest and easiest means of making their journey. But I think that the incentive for them to use those particular routes is reduced if effective mitigation is provided at the Linton Crossroads in the form of junction capacity improvements. And for that reason, we regard it as essential that this development contributes to that junction improvement via Section 106 agreement. It is on this basis that the Highway Authority has no grounds on which to sustain an objection to this application. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Wright. Now, are you indicating Councillor Mumford? I thought you were. As you're fairly near, we'll take you first.
This application is policy compliant. Makes it very, very difficult for us to vote against it. The site's been there 4 or 5 years, public consultation and everything. I would like to address what the officer has said. He spoke about criteria. I'd like to talk about Clockhouse Farm, 43 care homes. We were asked to ignore that. That was the criteria. I could take you back to Baltimore and Chelsea, where there was an access only onto Church Street, which I challenged during the consultation, and we succeeded in removing. Mr. Wright has said that highways have been asked to look at Forstall Lane. And my problem there is we haven't asked them to look to the south. And I've read everything that's in the report. Now, it's about viability and deliverability. That's what we're talking about here tonight. And I'm not talking about objecting to this and stopping this. A more sensible scheme is achievable. If we look at the developments to Stockett Lane, Forstall Lane, we have money there that could be used to have a southern access, and that's what we're being asked to look at, is the access. Viability's terms, how often have we been sat here and discussing putting the yield up because it's more viable? How many times have we been asked to consider the affordable housing element and reducing that to make it more viable? These are negotiations that could take place. We've heard tonight that the third party that owns a piece of ground will be reasonable. Well, he's got to be, because if he's not reasonable, it won't be viable and he will get nothing. And we will go to the north. I'm not suggesting which access on the southern boundary we look at, but I believe if we help, and this will go against the grain, the developer to make the site viable, and so many times we are, then I think we should defer, get highways to look at the southern access, attempt to make it viable for the developer, work with the developer. I think there is a way forward on a southern access. That's what we're being asked to look at. This is a disaster. It's a disaster for Lewes, which is a gem in the borough. It's a disaster for Tuville. You sit in this new development and you've got a route to avoid Linton Corner and the Wheatsheaf, you will take it. I don't care how bad they make that route, it's bad enough, but you will take it because of the time you spend there. I am going to propose we defer this. We instruct our officers to negotiate a southern access to this site that is viable. That may cost us, but we've sat here and discussed viability, affordable housing. That way we can reposition the open space to the south and put the anti-coalition band back in, which we've lost. I used the wrong word, sorry. I'm not as articulate as the rest of you. But I see the opportunity to make this better. And I am proposing we defer, instruct the officers to look at a southern access, make it viable, come back and tell us what the cost is.
Before you go on, Councillor Mumford, a point was raised about Section 106s by Councillor Mortimer in terms of the bus service. If I'm not saying we will, but if we were to defer it, obviously, if there are issues, we should be deferring for a range of issues and not adding them on later on. So I just wanted to question whether you were.
Yeah, I will take that, and whatever other members would like looked at. I would like to add one thing: the Badger situation. There is an Act of Parliament, and it does allow licences, and it even allows a licence for development to close a Badger set. I don't want to get involved in the Badger argument, but the opportunity is there. So that is not a showstopper either. I believe we can have a better access to this site.
Right, Councillor Mumford, you have proposed something at this point. Councillor Clark was first on that, and as he seconded that, I will take your speech now if you so wish, because that is how the...
Thank you, Chairman. I couldn't have put it better, to be honest. I think most people in this room, when they look at this proposal, they would look at what's on the table and they would look at what's possible, and they would, in their right mind, they would look at this and say, you've got to try again, because it's such a better proposal to have it go through the existing housing than to go out on a leg in Forstall Lane. In terms of whether or not we can stop traffic to move up through Wells Street or not, I just feel we can make this proposal better. I think we can also look at the way that we buffer between the built form and the open countryside better if we have such an access. So I fully support the proposal. I would like to also, given the sensitivity of the site and the undulation of the site, consider a further condition about the height of the houses, because we get an awful lot of these sites that come forward and they've got a large block, or they've got sort of 2.5 stories. I think we should look at reducing the height, perhaps to either 2 or 2.5 stories.
Right, so can I ask Councillor Mumford if it were deferred on the two grounds you propose, whether you are prepared to entertain a discussion on the height of the buildings at the same time?
Yes, and I would like to add to that because we haven't got the anti-coalescent policies in anymore, if we can give the illusion of countryside on Forstall Road by using the open space, I'd like that considered.
We got that. We've got those 4 points. Now, right, I'm going to take the two speakers I've already got, and then I'm going to come... Sorry, Mr. Bailey? Yes, absolutely. Don't worry, we're going nowhere near a vote at the moment. But got a couple of members who indicated right at the start who I'm going to take. Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's worth considering why we are in this position and even having this conversation. And the reality is it's because of what's actually in the local plan under H158 at the end of the day, which is forced KCC, as far as I can see, to say, well, this is what we've been asked to consider. We've not been asked to consider what you actually are really concerned about here, which is about the secondary access onto the site from the southern boundary. And the reality is that because of the local plan process that every single council has to go through, you end up in a situation where what's proposed in the local plan does not necessarily match what residents want here. And the reality is a number of us, including visiting members here today, voted in favour of the local plan. I'm assuming that doesn't mean that we agree with every single word of it, but it does make it much harder for us as a planning committee, as a regulatory committee in a quasi-judicial position to make big alterations to what's in front of us. Having said that, my understanding is that obviously when the inspector was considering this site and every other site in the local plan, he was looking at it as a site, whether that site was suitable, whether the proposals on the table were suitable. He wasn't necessarily looking, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, to see whether two adjoining sites in the local plan could in effect join up and you could have access running through the sites. So bearing that in mind, I don't think we should be surprised that the inspector did not suggest that we have a southern access, because he wasn't being asked that question either. So, bearing in mind these questions haven't been asked, it comes upon us as a planning committee to ask those questions, and I wholeheartedly agree with the points that Councillors Mumford and Clark have raised so far. So, Mr Chairman, I can't see any alternative here but to defer this application. I'll be honest and say it's going to be incredibly difficult. It's impossible for us to refuse this at the moment. The principle of development is established as in the local plan, and as a consequence, we are where we are because of planning policy. So I'm happy to support what's on the table from Councillors Mumford and Clark.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. I will ask for an officer response in due course, but I'm going to take Councillor Harwood first.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Bolton is right, of course, in that the Planning Committee is a regulatory committee and we are bound by the development plan. All we can look at is whether there is detail, if there are issues, if we can engineer some improvement. There are always problems with going against policy and potentially bringing an appeal onto us, because when there's an appeal, it makes the scheme less viable. Therefore, the eventual scheme is usually less good in terms of design quality, in terms of all the innovations that we seek in Maidstone. So this is not a penalty-free approach for the local residents. You know, by delaying this, we could end up with a worse scheme. But I do agree with Councillor Mumford that we must try. But we need to be very, very careful about the way that we frame any deferral. And also what we contain within that deferral. As you know, I certainly do not carry a torch for our new local plan. Our 93 local plan and our 2000 local plan were local. This is not a local plan, it's an imposed plan. I don't think local plan should even be in the title. It's a government document, essentially, to plaster blame onto local councillors for unpopular decisions. However, what is critical is that we create a line in the sand around Coxheath so that we do not see a sprawl of development on towards Lewes, on towards Bourton Monchelsea, and essentially we end up with a weavering situation where we lose a hamlet or a village in the urban sprawl. To my mind, now that we've lost the ability to have anti-coalescence policies in the local plan, new local plan, the way to achieve this is by creating a buffer around the site. So to that end, I think that the deferral should investigate ensuring that the open space, the eastern open space, is perhaps slightly tweaked so that it rounds off the corner of the site, so that the kind of Aspian Drive and the wider development, you round it off so that you're not creating a natural phase 2 for development to go into the next field. And we know the approaches developers use. You have a cul-de-sac that stops at a hedge and you know where phase 2 is going to go. What we need to do is to create a barrier around it. And actually that links into the issue around protected wildlife, because we have got badger populations surviving in Grove Green housing estates. So the way that we did that is we left the areas where they were completely wild. And if you go to Tesco's and so on along Grovewood Drive North, you'll go through little patches of wilderness. And that's where we've got protected wildlife, and it is surviving. So I think we need to stipulate that within our deferral, that we're also deferring to look at a more robust and prescriptive landscape approach to provide that buffer and to provide the wildlife protection. And coming back to this deferral, as I mentioned earlier on, our decisions must accord with the development plan. We cannot do anything else. But you can look at the relative weight of different policies within the local plan. So I think that we do need to bring in SB 17 and the countryside policies and so on to state that the collateral damage from the widening of Forstall Lane and the wider impact on the wider countryside is so significant that the ripples in the pond, if you like, we can mitigate the harm on this field, but in fact we're causing harm off-site with the widening and the urbanisation of the surrounding lane network. And I think that's potentially the way that we do this. So I do support it, but I support it as long as we toughen up that landscape condition and we do give a reason why we are deferring, because we're balancing generic countryside protection policies with the policies attached to H158, because I do not believe that one field, H158, trumps the wider countryside SP17.
No, I see where you're going with that, Councillor Harwood, and with some of your other points. I'm sure Councillor Mumford and Clark were taking notes, but we will return to those points later. Now, I would ask members to, because we're going down a particular form of debate, at this time, can we take any further considerations in relation to a possible deferral? Because I don't want... and then when we've got them all together, I'm going to ask the officers to come back. So, Councillor Cox.
Mine's just for clarity, really. Can you just clear up, are we asking to defer to solely look at access to the south only, or are we looking at how it would change the transport modelling if both were open? So
actually, I think there is an issue there, because before we started this debate, when Mr Wright was very eloquently outlining the Highways position, it did occur to me that given the sensitivity of this issue, even if we were not to achieve renegotiation of a successful renegotiation of the access, it's a bit, I think, risky to have a position where we're talking about what several possible approaches to mitigation, which I think was your words, Brendan. Correct me if I got those slightly wrong. I think that, if we were going to be looking at mitigation, I'm not saying we should stick with the original route or mitigate it, but I'm saying that if we were going down that path, I think it would be, frankly, at least we should be considering that in more detail before we grant permission rather than afterwards. And so I would say, I think you're right, Councillor Cox, that I think Councillor Harwood's point about the countryside protection policy and the wider issues takes precedence, but we have to bear in mind that there are issues that remain even if the existing proposed access were to go forward. So I think that is a point. You can come back after Mr Bolton's briefly reprised his...
Yes, it was kind of following on from what Councillor Cox says, because something which we don't have much detail on, if we defer on Highways grounds and they come back and say, look, we can't reach an agreement or whatever, and we're kind of stuck with what we've got, then it's a question I would ask then, so I'm thinking I may as well ask this now, which is these priority junctions, or these junctions that don't encourage you to turn right, or whatever they are, we seem very vague in the detail about those, because from my experience, these don't work, to be totally blunt. So if we are to sort of look at the wider highway issues on this, Mr Chairman, then I do think this needs to be addressed, because I don't feel we've got satisfactory information in front of us on this particular junction in order to make a decision tonight, irrespective of what we're talking about with alternative access. So I thought that was an important point to put out there, bearing in mind we are actually going to be deferring on highways issues.
Exactly. Now I'm going to ask Mr Bailey, who's been very patient, to come back.
Thank you, Chair. There's a lot to go through with all the member discussion. I think I'll start from what Councillor Borton's just raised in terms of matter, because if I'm honest, I'm slightly confused in terms of potentially what this deferment could achieve. I can totally understand members are considering access at this stage. This is what they're considering. And if members consider that that access point could be many suitable or different alternatives, quite rightly, I agree with you. You could defer it on that point and say, actually, as I'm considering access, I need to know exactly what those priority junctions are going to do and what the detailed design is. Now, quite legitimately, you're considering access. What I'm very confused about is the proposal in terms of what Councillor Harwood was saying in terms of the issues by looking at Stockett Lane, because what we're looking at is an application that follows the policy that's been through so many iterations of the Reg 18, Reg 19 and consideration by members, was ratified with the report to go to the inspector by full council. So in terms of, I don't know in terms of individual members, but the majority vote ratified that local plan to be submitted to the Planning Inspectorate. The Planning Inspectorate cited his interim findings, and I've reiterated those issues previously, what the inspector said. He considered, and going back to what Councillor Borton said previously, I was in the room for those hearings for this particular site when the objectors raised the issue of Forstall Lane. So the inspector did consider that in definite detail and did look at the very wording of the policy which said access to be from Forstall Lane only. Now, there were specific reasons why that access was coming off Forstall Lane to allow delivery of this site separately. Now, Kent Highways were there at that particular time, and I specifically asked them and said to Highways, you've commented on the Reg 18, you've commented on the Reg 19, please comment to the local plan inspector what your view is on access to Forstall Lane. And Kent Highways commented on that issue to Forstall Lane, and the inspector endorsed that. Now, I appreciate members don't like that, but that was specifically considered at that hearing, and I was there personally, where the inspector looked at that in detail and looked at the specifics and found that policy sound. He found the SP13 sound, he found the H158 sound. So he found that particular access sound. Highways commented it at that time and have commented on the suitability of access for Forstall Lane throughout this local plan. So it cannot, in my view, just come up at this last stage, because it has been considered. So I think I have to stress that point. I also think that what's been missed here, and I do appreciate what Mr Hawkins has said and the landowner who he's representing, there is a ransom strip across that site. I've done my own research on that, and my own research indicates that a potential ransom strip could incur, and I could incur, a cost between 30 to 50% of the land value with a consented scheme. How much that land value is, I don't know. Could be million, 2 million, 10 million, I don't know. But it is a ransom strip, and if there is no agreement, which councils don't get involved in those kind of discussions, I appreciate Mr Hawkins has turned around and said he'll be reasonable. What is reasonable? It is not a consideration that you can look at. There is an access. It has been considered. It has been endorsed. You are effectively forcing an applicant to go down an alternative route where there is a ransom strip, where there could be an unknown figure, and we would not get involved in those discussions. So I have to point that out very clearly. You are forcing an applicant who has purely followed the policy requirement into a route of going through an access, an alternative ransom strip, which is extremely costly. I have costings, because the planning officer's report does set out quite clearly at 6.22 that the applicant has engaged with the landowner, and he has had discussions. He's also engaged with the local ward members in terms of discussions. He's even gone so far as to cost it through a cost consultant, through what those costings will do in terms of roundabouts on Heath Road, in terms of engineering works, in terms of the access through the site. So that level of detail has been gone through. It's not a public document, and therefore on that basis the work that members are asking or deferring it has already been done. That costing does not include negotiations between a ransom strip between third-party landowners. That sum could be unlimited, and it could prevent the site coming forward, and we wouldn't be party of those discussions. So, to my mind, it would be unreasonable in those terms to force an applicant down that particular route. And I have to say that, and I use unreasonable in the terms of the cost issues, members, because obviously whatever deferment comes forward, if a deferment does come forward on this issue, the applicant is easily within an appeal period, and he may just turn around and say, actually, I'll take it through an appeal process. I'm here to advise members, and my duty is to advise members of those issues. He has followed the policy requirements, and in terms of my view, forcing someone to go through a ransom strip is not a deliverable, because that person who owns the ransom strip just to say, if you don't pay the money, you're not coming through. And you can't be in that position. So I have to stress that point very, very clearly. With regard to changing character, yes, every housing allocation changes that character. The report goes into the details of the sensitivity testing of this site. It accepted that this site could accommodate housing development in this locality, and hence that's why this site was allocated in the now draft Maidstone local plan. So I think there are concerns that I've got, very strong concerns, and I have to raise members in terms of the issues, the potential cost issues, because duty-bound, you could have an appeal for non-determination on your hands. I would have to bring this back to members. The issue with the access, in terms of what I could do, is, and it's reasonable to get a design that you need to be satisfied with. Perfectly, I accept that, because that's what you're considering. I totally understand that, and that's what you legitimately could do. I do not think that you could defer it for officers to negotiate an alternative access. I know what those costings are, and they don't include the ransom strip. So, on those bases, in terms of other issues, I just, again, need to sort of take you back in terms of, we had member training last night. I have to take you back, and Councillor Harwood has raised it, to the fundamental principles of planning, Section 38(6) and 72 of the Town and Country Planning Act. Members are required to determine the application in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Now, unfortunately, the applicant has followed the development plan in these places. I accept the fact it's not formally adopted and fully adopted, but I have said it attracts very significant weight on that basis. And I have to take you back to what the NPPF says. Paragraph 12. The National Planning Framework does not change the status of the development plan as the starting point for decision making. Proposed development that accords with an up-to-date local plan should be approved, and proposed development that conflicts should be refused unless other material considerations indicate otherwise. I don't wish to go through every point, but paragraph 14, in terms of the presumption in favour of development, the agent has set out the benefits arising from the scheme. They're very strong material considerations. And in decision-making on paragraph 14, it says, approving development proposals that accord with the development plan without delay. This will add significant delays, and as I said, negotiations could go on for months and years, because there is a third party with a ransom strip who I would have no control over. I know I'm going on, members, but I really do have to stress the difficulties.
Right. Now. Right, members. I'm going to try and draw this to some sort of conclusion in a few minutes. There are still a few speakers to come, so don't worry. You won't be missed off for those people who've indicated already. I think we are not debating, or at least no one so far has debated, refusing the application. I think you're quite right, Mr. Bailey, that would be extremely problematic. We are discussing whether or not there are grounds for deferral. I think there's certainly some grounds. So it's a question of which grounds and what should be included. I personally think that it's quite clear that this site is judged suitable as a housing allocation. That's what the plan says. We have occasionally, when we got to application stage, looked at the interplay of different strategic policies within the plan with actual site policies, and that is, I believe, what Councillor Harwood was talking about, was the interplay between the SP17 in the emerging plan and the specific characteristics of the site. It's also what Councillor Mumford and Councillor Clark were, I think, referring to in relation to looking at the height of the buildings, and Councillor Harwood's point about slightly realigning the landscaping on the east, I think it's the eastern side of the site. I think those are the 4 points with the bus service that have actually been proposed, along with Councillor Bolton's point of actually widening out the discussion to look at the highways issues to include, if the original access proposed did go ahead, what the mitigation would be. So those are the 5 points. Now, clearly, that's the debate. Members need to decide. The officer has given a fairly strong indication of his own views. Members have articulated, and parish councils have articulated, some strong views in the other direction. But I thought it was just appropriate at this point to set out, in my view, what the 5 points that have been raised for potential deferral at this stage were. Now I turn to Councillor Prendergast.
Thank you. I'm just looking for some clarification because there isn't the detail in the committee report. Education. Is there capacity at Coxheath School, do we know? And where are the children expected to go to school if there isn't? Depending on the answer, I'd like to come back, please.
In terms of the exact detail, I mean, obviously, I haven't got the KCC's exact figures right in front of me in terms of capacity, so I can't answer your question. They've said it's a SIL compliance issue. It could be for a number of reasons in terms of contributions to the school that they're not collecting them, due to the fact that their commissioning plan seeks to expand outside of those areas. But in terms of your direct question, I haven't got the information to hand in terms of whether that contribution is effectively what you're asking is whether it could go to Coxheath instead of somewhere else, instead of what they're proposing.
Right.
Well, I'm asking because the papers say that the KCC are seeking a financial contribution of just over £3,000 to go towards the permanent expansion of Southborough Primary School to a two-form entry. And if you recall, the Barty Farm application, which we considered in April, I think, this year, I think we established that the permanent two-form entry at Southborough School had already taken place. So potentially, I do not want to see a situation where the children from Barty Farm are not going to have a school place at Southborough. And if these children are destined to go to Southborough, I want to be confident that there's a school place for them somewhere, because that permanent expansion has taken place. When was this dated? Do we know? I can't get into my iPad here to check, but when did KCC ask for the contribution towards Southborough Primary School? Because as far as I'm concerned, that expansion has taken place. And then the other thing that I'm really concerned about, and I'd quite like to know the reason why the head of planning is asking for delegated powers on youth services and social care, because those are not the remit of Maidstone Borough Council. I'd just quite like to know why those two have been singled out, because they are the remit of a different authority. I'm interested.
Mr. Bailey?
I mean, the reasons why, as I said, my legal colleague asked for delegation is because in terms of the SIL 122 test, in terms of making sure that where those contributions are going meets those requirements. Now, the issue is that an application, KCC request those contributions. It is Maidstone Borough Council who decides whether those contributions actually fully meet the SIL tests and whether there are other measures or other mitigation measures, because there may be a viability issue, that they shouldn't be sought because maybe the money should be spent elsewhere. So KCC will always request, but the determining authority is MBC. So they ultimately decide what monies are actually collected through the planning permission. The first part of it, as I said, I don't have that details. When they came, I don't have the comments from Alan Gilbert from KCC, so I can't provide that detail at this point in time.
It does seem quite important if this expansion has taken place. Councillor Prent.
Well, it does raise some real questions about the sustainability and whether this meets the criteria as set out in paragraph 14. I think this is another question that we need answers to before we go any further.
Well, I know the list is building up, but I'm sure the movers of the motion are paying attention. It does seem that it's something that we could legitimately ask for clarification on if there is a deferral. Councillor Stockel.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I've listened to Mr Bailey and had our knuckles rapped. We are here really to get the best we can for Coxheath in this particular application, and we have to look at a much wider thing than just, you know, this policy ticks that box and that box. Coxheath, 600 names on a petition, 300 objections on the website. They clearly do not want this. It's contrary to their local neighbourhood plans, not in there. They've taken an awful lot of development, you know, and willingly so. They are a rural service centre, but this particular application is really going to erode that coalescent strip between Coxheath and Lewes, and it will just go on. And I think, you know, enough is enough, really. There's air quality here, there's all the impact of traffic going up Socket Lane, etc. And they've taken more than their fair share, as I've said, of development. So we really owe it to them to get it right. And I think DHA Transport, their letter to us, actually, you know, concur that there'll be a lot of rat running and a lot of traffic going on from that development through the rural lanes of Coxheath and Lewes and Tovel. So, you know, I think we need to defer it to sort of sort out some of these issues, and we need to have a firm stop there and an anti-coalescent strip which is dedicated to, you know, not running straight on down into Tovel. So, you know, I would welcome a deferral. I would have had a refusal, but I would welcome a deferral. I think we owe Coxheath to get this right. Thanks, Chairman.
Right. Okay, I've got 3 speakers left, and then we are going to move to wrapping up the grounds for potential deferral, and that will be that this evening. Councillor Powell.
Just an observation, Mr Chairman. I mean, one of the things that was rightly said, I mean, this decision was made very difficult for us 2 years when the local council decided to actually kind of ratify the local plan. I wasn't a councillor then, but it doesn't take too much working out which way I would have voted that evening. But anyway, that's another question altogether. I'm slightly confused about what Mr Bailey said this evening about exactly what can we achieve. Well, I think we've come up with a number of ideas tonight as to exactly what we can achieve. And I will suggest 1 or 2 things of my own, which won't come as any surprise. Just doing the pure sums here. Whatever the access point is, it still amounts to traffic. If we're looking at 2.5 cars per household, and we're talking about 210 households, that works out at over 1,000 traffic movements each day, whatever entrance they come out of. This area can't take any more kind of traffic, let alone 1,000, you know, movements a day, and that's just the toing and froing from schools and work without the social kind of movements that could be added to that. So, whilst I'm supporting a deferral this evening, and I would like to see some sort of traffic impact report, and I think that if we was to do a fair and honest traffic impact report, when this gets brought back to the council, well, I'll be very, very surprised if we would all be supporting it at that stage. But equally, I'd like the developer to work with us on this. This is not kind of developer bashing or Kent Highways bashing, although I do have to ask myself 1 or 2 questions about some of the Kent Highways reports sometimes. I think, to a certain degree, common sense has got to take its place within this kind of argument. And, you know, this is one of the issues that we have whenever we have cumulative building, is the impact and the pressure it puts on local kind of societies and a local road network which just isn't made for the amount of property that is being put in its place. So whilst I'll be supporting the deferral, it's going to have to become a very, very good argument that's put in front of me before I can support it at that deferred meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. That is admirably clear. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I do agree that policy has a heavy weighting on what we decide ultimately, but I feel that we're not forcing the developer on this proposal. We are looking at this site and we are saying, as a planning committee, are there better options? Do we feel that if we try something here and we defer and we take another look at it, that we could end up with a better proposal than the one that's coming forward? And I really do think that we are going to end up with a better proposal. I do understand that the cost of ransom strips, but when you look at this proposal and you look at the weight of policy behind this proposal, there's a reduction in the value of that ransom strip. If you've got the option to take this to appeal and feel that you've got a pretty good case because the policy is behind you, then you're not going to offer the price on a ransom strip as you would if you had a completely landlocked site. So I think that there's I don't know how that negotiation may or may not go, but I do feel that the ransom strip in this case is potentially more achievable than it might be on a completely landlocked field. And I feel that we, as a planning committee, we should look to make the best of this site, and there is a better option than that on the papers.
Well, we don't know that, but that's what we could potentially explore. Councillor Mumford, you get the last word.
I think Councillor Clark said most of it. Thank you very much, officers. I would like consistent advice, but thank you very much for your advice. When this site was initially looked at, the overriding factor was it deliverable? If it had to rely on the site to the south, it would not have been deliverable. Hence, we are looking at Forstall Lane. Circumstances have changed since the inspector looked at it and since Michael Murphy went out and assessed it a long time ago. And at that time, Forstall Lane was the only option. Now there is another option, and all I'm asking is officers look at what assistance we can give to the developer in viability terms, as we are asked to do so often. I'm asking the developer to cooperate with us, along with the parish council, to get a better scheme. That's all we're trying to do here. As for the ransom strip, the frightener the officer put us on there, well, if the owner of that were to ask eye-watering amounts, it wouldn't be viable and we'd be back to Forstall Road and he'd get nothing. So he has got to be reasonable.
Yeah, I think we mustn't be in danger of over-analysing this. What I have so far, before we move to any conclusion, is this is in no particular order. Well, it is in some order. We have the issue to a proposal, proposed and seconded deferral to explore the issues around the proposed access and the potential mitigation if the existing proposed access were to go forward. That's two separate but related points. We have the point about the night bus on the section 106. We have the exploration of the point around whether or not Southborough School development has taken place and whether there is any potential Section 106 funding for the Cox Heath School. I think I've got that right. We have the question of whether or of the tweaking of the boundary of the public open space on the eastern side. Now, Tony, did you want to be a little more specific at this point or not?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that nature abhors a straight line. I think my concern here is that we need to tighten up that the open space is on the eastern edge, and that actually it needs to be, if you like, more elliptical so that we round off the corner. And so it's a more natural rounding off of the development extension into the countryside to create a more defensible line. And linked into that, because this is an outline, we will need some reassurance that the landscape treatment for this is a semi-natural approach with significant tree and shrub planting to create that genuine countryside buffer which will retain our badgers, which will retain the view into this development from the countryside.
I think that's specific enough. And finally, I think I might need some more detail on this, on the question of height of buildings.
Restricted from to 2 to 2.5 stories.
Yes, but there's no harm in reiterating it. I think I've got it. I think that's everything. Have I missed anything out? Yes, in a moment, but I just want to make sure I've got everything before I do that. Have I missed anything? Councillor
Can
Stockman?
I ask about the air quality
No,
here? Is that something that we can't look at?
I think that issue has been explored, but thank you very much on that point. Right.
Cumulative.
Yeah, that has been explored. Right. Councillor Cox.
Councillor Grigg did mention that there may be a stronger method of looking at the no right turn. So if we're looking at access... Right. Okay.
Right, very briefly.
I'm not going to go over our grounds, just those last 2 points. In terms of, I'm just pointing out to members, obviously these parameters are not being considered. They are parameters, so members obviously could do, at this stage, define, as it's an outline application, define open space and height. You could turn around now and say no more than 12 metres on any part of the site from existing ground levels, and that's restricted to 2. So you could do that right on this application. I just think it's worth asking Kent Highways regarding the issues of a nighttime bus contribution at this stage, because obviously a request hasn't come from KHS on this application for bus nighttime working. None of the other housing schemes have contributed, and if you were looking at that, you would normally expect a pro rata contribution from all the other 500 units that the Cox Heath comprises of. It wouldn't be right in terms of Section 106 seal regulations and reasonableness just to require a bus contribution from one when those other sites haven't come forward. So if I could, Mr Chairman, just ask Highways to comment on that issue. I accept the fact you're asking us to consider it and look into it, but I'm just giving you a view of how it would come forward.
Indeed, it is considered at this stage. Mr Wright.
I think it's difficult to provide a definitive answer, but clearly we will need to understand how that is justified and what it will deliver. And only then can we take a view on whether it's reasonable to require it as part of the 106.
Thank you very much, Mr Wright. That's very, very helpful. I think what we're saying is that it may or may not be reasonable to include it, but my view at the moment is reasonable to consider it. I think that is reasonable for what you're saying. Thank you very much. That's very useful. Now, is everyone clear on what is in the proposal? Okay. Right. The officers would like a couple of minutes to get the word in together, in which case I will adjourn the meeting for 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes while they do that. The mover and seconder would like to come up here and assist.